Thank you, Hashem. Thank you, Hashem. Thank you, Hashem. Thank you, Hashem. Haidul Hashem. Haidul Hashem. Kili Olam Li Olam Hasdoi. Haidul Hashem. Kili Olam Hasdo. Give thanks to Hashem, for his kindness is everlasting. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Whew, we're approaching the end of Tanis Esther, the fast of Esther. The fast that Queen Esther decreed when the original Purim story happened. Oh, man, there's still plenty of daylight out there. So we're going a little early. And then we're an hour early today, as I mentioned yesterday, because from here I'll be going to evening services and then a Megillah reading. Tomorrow's class, which is always at noon on Fridays, won't be a class. I will be going live, but we'll be doing our annual reading of the Book of Esther. So that'll be at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern tomorrow, Friday. Once evening comes in today, then we'll say Hag Purim Sameach, a happy Purim to you. You should have a freilich in Purim. It should be a beautiful, festive, awesome, and meaningful Purim. But we're not quite there yet. Right now we're in the fast before Purim. So I'm a little weak. I was going to get up before dawn, before daylight. Before sunrise. I keep forgetting. Dawn is when the first light appears, and then sunrise is when the sun comes up in the sky. So the fast begins at dawn, right? So you had to eat today. It's not like Yom Kippur. It's not a 25-hour fast. So you could get up early this morning, before there was any light in the sky, and have some food. But we didn't do that, although we did have a late night snack last night to sort of keep us going. So we're running on fumes here, but that's okay. And today's daf, not an easy one. Bit of a challenge. We've got 2 Mishnas we'll be covering, but let's have some fun as we light up the darkness. And that song, by the way, was Thank You Hashem by Joey Newcomb, featuring our own Moshe Storch singing on it as well. Who is with us as we get it going on a pre-Purim end of fast class? Paul in Chicago, Pauline in Arkansas, Stephen. He's enjoying a coffee and Hummintashen with tonight's class. I think Stephen, it's already dark where he is. James says shalom. Melissa in Great Neck. Michael at Castle Grayskull in Eternia. Okay. Lynn says shalom. Ann in Merced. Lucy in Minnesota. I think a lot of people have been weakened by the fast today. So if you're here, shkoyach, meaning yasher koach, may you be strengthened to do other, admirable mitzvahs, admirable learning. Marasia is saying Happy Purim, and Lynn in Texas says Hag Purim Sameach. Welcome, everybody. All right, we are holding here. It's page Tzadi Vav, page 96 here in Tractate Pesachim, the 4th volume of the Talmud. We are studying the laws of Passover. We're in chapter 9, and today we're going to be covering Mishnas 5 and 6. Tomorrow, like I said, we'll be reading the book of Esther during our class, so we won't be doing a page of Talmud. And we'll probably do a double page Saturday night, although I was just looking ahead a little bit, and there are some actually short pages coming up. So during Shabbos, as I'm reading this and learning, I'll think about, should we do the double daf Saturday night and get us right back on schedule, as fast as possible, or maybe do the double on Sunday or Monday when there's short pages anyway. It doesn't really make that much of a difference, but I'll let you know about that after Shabbos on Saturday night. Okay, so here we are. We're in the 5th Mishnah. And largely this chapter is devoted to issues surrounding the differences between the first Pesach and the second Pesach. That's when the temple is standing and we're bringing the Passover offering. If a person is disqualified from bringing the offering at Passover, meaning the first Pesach opportunity on the 15th of Nisan, because he is ritually impure or away from Jerusalem, far away, and we defined that distance a few days ago, so then he would come back a month later to fulfill his obligation. Now, as the chapter is continuing, tonight we'll be talking about the difference not between first and second Passover in any year when the offerings are brought, meaning that the temple is standing in Jerusalem, but tonight we're discussing the difference between the first Passover, meaning the Pesach that was consumed in Egypt prior to our leaving Egypt and leaving slavery in Egypt, and Passover in all the subsequent generations. I believe we're up to, we're somewhere around 3,300 and some odd Passovers that we've observed since we left slavery in Egypt. And then then we'll open our discussion of the sixth Mishna, and there we're going to be getting a little bit into the nuance of replacing a lost Passover lamb or a lost Passover goat, and what are the issues surrounding that. So let's get into it. Now that we're discussing the differences between the first Pesach in Egypt and subsequent generations observing the Pesach, I'm just going to read quickly the summation of the halacha, the law, and then I'll read the Mishnah, because it can get a little bit challenging, and so let's just keep a real clear focus on what it is we're talking about. So the halacha, where this discussion is going to end up, is that several of the mitzvahs stated with regard to the Paschal lamb offered in Egypt applied only to the Paschal lamb in Egypt, but not the Paschal lamb of later generations. Examples of these mitzvahs, these commandments, are setting aside the Paschal lamb on the 10th of the month, right? In the Torah, God told Moses to tell the Jewish people, set the Paschal lamb aside on the 10th of the month. Why? So that they could examine it and make sure that it was unblemished. When they offered it on the night of the 15th, right? Slaughtered it on the afternoon of the 14th and ate it on the night of the 15th. Examples of these mitzvahs are, so setting aside the Paschal lamb on the 10th of the month of Nisan, sprinkling its blood on the lintel and the two doorposts with a bundle of hyssop, right? So that's where we get the name Passover, because when the lamb was slaughtered, some of its blood was taken with a hyssop branch and dabbed on the doorposts of the Jewish homes and on the lintel, right? So it was on both sides of the door and above it, and this was the marker of the Jewish homes, so that when the angel of death would come through and mete out justice to the Egyptians for inflicting the sin of slavery on the Jews with the plagues, and this was the 10th plague, which was the slaying of the firstborn. That did not happen in the Jewish homes. It only happened in the homes of the Egyptians, and the Jewish homes were marked with this blood on the doorposts of the Paschal lamb. That it was only done in Egypt and never since then. And finally, the commandment to consume the meat in haste. It wasn't a leisurely dinner, hey, let's enjoy ourselves when we ate the meat in Egypt. Since then, one of the commandments, one of the customs of Passover is that we recline, and we actually are able to see ourselves almost as an aristocracy, which normally only the rich people would recline. The Passover Seder, in certain respects, is influenced by Greek tradition, actually, and this idea that people would have a meal and discussion. That's something that only the rich people could do, right? Poor people just ate quickly and got back to work, or they didn't have so much food to eat, period. But at the Seder, everyone should see himself as having the leisure to eat not only a bountiful meal, but to spend a lot of time talking about faith and God and the redemption and all the important ideas of the Passover story. So that's how we do it since then. But in Egypt, and in Egypt only, there was a command to eat it in haste. Why? Because we were about to have a national exodus out of Egypt. So those are three examples of the laws that only applied to the first Paschal lamb. The Mishnah number 5 here in chapter 9. What are the differences between the Paschal lamb that the Jewish people offered in Egypt and the Paschal lamb offered in all later generations? The Paschal lamb the Jewish people offered in Egypt had to be taken from the 10th of the month of Nisan and required the people to sprinkle its blood with a bundle of hyssop, unlike the Paschal lamb in all later years, and its blood also was sprinkled upon the lintel and the 2 doorposts, and it was eaten with haste. In addition, the Paschal lamb in Egypt was only on one night, whereas the Paschal lamb throughout the generations is observed for 7 days. That is a confusing statement. What does that mean? We know that even as long as the temple is standing and we're bringing the Paschal lamb, it must be eaten that night in all later generations. So what does the Mishnah mean here when it says that the lamb in Egypt was one night, but in later generations, all 7 nights? We don't eat the Paschal lamb for 7 nights. We might bring festival offerings. We eat matzah for 7 days, or at least we cannot eat leavened bread for 7 days, but we don't eat the Paschal lamb for 7 days. So this is going to require a little bit of digging in later. The Gemara on this Mishnah. The Gemara asks, from where do we conclude that the requirements of the Paschal lamb sacrificed in Egypt do not apply in later generations? Right, so what is going to be the biblical textual source for this understanding that certain things were different for that lamb as for all other generations, even though Passover is modeled on eating when we ate the Paschal lamb in Egypt, there would be some important differences for all other Passovers observed. So as it is written, this is Exodus 12:3, speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, they shall take to them every man a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. That's Exodus 12:3. And we derive from the superfluous word this, right, where it says on the 10th day of this month. It could have just said on the 10th day of the month. So from the superfluous word this, because the, by the way, in Hebrew is not a separate word. When we say the, we would just put ha in front of the word. But this requires a separate word. So this, that this Paschal lamb offered in Egypt had to be taken from the 10th of Nisan, and the Paschal lamb of later generations is not taken from the 10th of Nisan. Right? In later generations, when people are making their pilgrimage, their festival pilgrimage up to Jerusalem, they're bringing the lamb, but it is not necessarily so that that they set that lamb aside on the 10th as the Paschal lamb, and if they didn't, then it's too late. In fact, you can designate the Paschal lamb right up until midday on the 14th, at which time is the time to slaughter it. Right? You also have to have your group of people designated on that lamb, but you didn't have to do this on the 10th. So the next few paragraphs are going to get quite into the weeds on examining this idea, of examination, and is it so that we don't examine for a few days, when in fact there is this requirement of examining an offering for a few days before it's offered, but it's not the Paschal lamb. That's a different kind of offering, and the sages get involved in that. We're going to pick it up a little bit lower down, where they're going to look at another one of these differences, right? So is it really so that the Passover of the later generations is different than the Passover in Egypt? But with regard to that which is written at Exodus 12:8, and they shall eat the meat on that night. So too should it be inferred that this Paschal lamb offered in Egypt was eaten at night, and no other Paschal lamb offered in later generations must be eaten at night? But we know that it must be eaten at night. So they have that in common with the lamb that was eaten in Egypt. How do we know that? The Gemara answers that the verse states, you shall perform this service in this month, at Exodus 13:5. in order to teach that the halachas, the laws of the Paschal lamb sacrificed in Egypt, apply to later generations as well. There were certain laws that aren't going to apply, but the majority of the laws about the Paschal lamb eaten in Egypt will apply in later generations. It's only the ones that were really Egypt specific that are not going to apply later. The Gemara asks, rather, if so, why do I need the word "this" stated with regard to the Paschal lamb sacrificed in Egypt if all of the halachas relevant to that offering apply to the Paschal lambs in later generations? So why does it say this if we're going to really extend those laws for all other generations of the Passover? What is being distinguished? And the Gemara answers that the word "this" in that particular verse in Exodus 13:5 was needed for the derivations cited by Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva. Now, this was way back in Tractate Brachos on page 9, and there they were debating what does it mean that you shall eat it in haste, right? So the eat in haste was a commandment that was only given to the Jews in Egypt for that very first Passover. And then Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva were arguing about that. So what does in haste actually mean? Why are Elazar ben Azariah and Akiva cited over there back on page 9? So that might trigger that when we started Daf Yomi, the very first topic that we were talking about is the timing of saying the Shema in the evening and in the morning. And part of that discussion actually ends up in the Passover Haggadah, right? Where these sages were arguing all night. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva are two of those sages who were arguing, and whether, all the days, you shall recount this story all the days of your life, and whether that includes the days only or the days and the nights. That might sound familiar from the Passover Haggadah. There it was in the context of saying the Shema, but they were also talking about, well, what does it mean in Egypt to leave in haste? And basically, we're not going to redo that discussion here, but the crux of it was, did it mean that we had to finish eating the Paschal lamb by midnight when the angel of death came through Egypt? Or did we have to finish eating by morning when it was time to leave, right? So that was part of the issue that was there. We're going to proceed. Okay, so again, the Gemara asks, is it really true that the Paschal lamb was different in Egypt than in later generations? Let's look at that which is written in the context of the Paschal lamb offered in Egypt at Exodus 12:48. And no uncircumcised person shall eat from it. So that command was given about the lamb in Egypt. And is it different now? Do we, or at least when the temple is standing and the Passover lamb is brought in later generations? Remember, we haven't done this in 2,000 years, but we did do it for 1,000 years after we left Egypt. And during all those 1,000 years, when either the Mishkan was standing or the temple was standing in Jerusalem, all these laws applied. Well, was it true or not that an uncircumcised person could not eat of it? So this actually begs a few questions. First of all, here when he's talking about an uncircumcised person cannot eat of it, so that's going to be Jew or non-Jew, right? Now, an uncircumcised Jew is a different issue than an uncircumcised non-Jew. An uncircumcised Jew is not going to be allowed to eat from the Passover lamb because he's uncircumcised, though we saw that there was a possible exception for one where he wasn't circumcised because it was dangerous to have him circumcised. But if that was not the issue, if it was simply a Jew who was in a situation where a male Jew who was never circumcised, none of this applies to women. So if it was a male Jew that was never circumcised, he can't eat of the Passover lamb, but he remains obligated in eating matzah on the first night of Passover. A non-Jew, of course, is not obligated to eat matzah, is not obligated in any of the mitzvahs except for the Noahide mitzvahs, the 7 Noahide mitzvahs. While we're talking about this, it's worth mentioning that a question comes up is, can you invite non-Jews to a Passover Seder? There's no actual prohibition, don't invite a non-Jew to a Passover Seder. there are some issues surrounding it, however. One is we don't have the Passover lamb, so that we haven't had it in 2,000 years. So the fact that an uncircumcised person can't eat from the Passover lamb is not really the issue here. What is an issue is that it's a Yom Tov meal. It's a festival meal. Now, on a Yom Tov, on any Jewish festival, it's the same as Shabbos. No work is permitted except for cooking. Cooking is permitted on a festival, right? We can cook for the needs of the festival. However, we can cook only for the needs of the festival. A non-Jew isn't performing a mitzvah by enjoying a festival meal that's a Jewish holiday, right? It's nice if he does, but he's not fulfilling an obligation. So we can cook for Jews on a Yom Tov, but we can't cook for non-Jews on a Yom Tov. And that's why they wouldn't be invited. And the interesting exception is Shabbos. If Passover falls on Shabbos, then there's actually no restriction to invite a non-Jew to the Seder because you're not cooking for anybody. All the cooking was done before, since you can't cook on Shabbos for anybody. So then he or she could come. But if it's not Shabbos, the concern is that you'll come to cook a little extra or heat some food up for the non-Jew, and then you would be violating the prohibition on that you can only cook for the needs of the festival, and you can't cook, for example, a meal that you're going to eat after the festival, and you can't cook a meal that's for non-Jews who are not observing the festival. So that's, a word about that. Okay, but to continue here in our Gemara, and so it said about the Passover in Egypt, and no uncircumcised person shall eat from it, the Paschal lamb. And so too should it be inferred from that expression, from it, that it limits the application of the verse only to the Paschal lamb sacrificed in Egypt. That's the one he may not eat. But a non-Jew may eat from the Paschal lamb, or an uncircumcised person, an uncircumcised man may eat from the Paschal lamb in later generations. But we know that's not true. And the Gemara answers that the verse states, "You shall perform," which teaches that the halachas of the Paschal lamb sacrificed in Egypt apply to later generations as well. So it's almost like whatever laws it's possible to apply in later generations, that makes sense to apply in later generations, still apply in later generations. Right, but putting the blood on the lintel so that the angel of death will pass over. Okay, there's not going to be another angel of death coming to slay the firstborn. So of course we wouldn't do that in later generations. And likewise, we don't have to do it in haste because we're about to, make an exodus out of that country. That's another reason why that doesn't apply. But all the other laws pertaining to the Paschal lamb do apply. And so this kind of question and answer continues. And so what about the idea that no stranger shall eat from it? That's Exodus 12:43. So too should it be inferred that only from the Paschal lamb slaughtered in Egypt the stranger may not eat, but in later generations the stranger may eat of it. And again, the Gemara will derive, no, they shall perform, they shall perform it just as it was performed in Egypt. They will perform the laws that apply. Now, in this situation, it was said in Egypt, and it applies to later generations as well. No stranger shall eat from it. What is the stranger? The stranger is not a non-Jew. A stranger here, as it's defined, is the apostate Jew. Right, the apostate Jew. Now, it's been said, if a Jew converts to some other religion, he might be practicing that other religion, but he or she is still a Jew. And that is true. But if they have converted to some other religion and distanced themselves from the Almighty, then what they cannot do is eat from the Paschal lamb. If the temple is standing in Jerusalem and we're eating the Paschal lamb, one who has left Judaism is now an apostate Jew. They can certainly come back to synagogue. They can come back. They can do all kinds of things. We can have family get-togethers. We can do all kinds of things together. But halakhically, they cannot eat from the Paschal lamb. That was true in Egypt, and that is true in later generations as well. Hold on a second. And then, so we don't need to do that one. Okay. And, Okay, and then, continuing the same line of questioning about the eating the Paschal lamb in Egypt, the verse said, when you have circumcised him, then shall he eat from it. That's Exodus 12:44. So too should it be inferred from it that the Paschal lamb sacrificed in Egypt, he may not eat unless he first circumcises his sons and slaves. See, now we're not talking about the commandment to be circumcised. Now we're talking about the commandment to circumcise, meaning that a father is obligated to circumcise his sons, and a father is obligated to have, when slavery was still in existence, he was commanded that his slaves would be circumcised if they're slaves in a Jewish home. So that's an obligation on the father, right? And so now the question is, can the father who has not performed that mitzvah himself, he hasn't circumcised his sons, does that mean that even though he himself, the father, is circumcised, may he eat from the Paschal lamb? And the answer is no, he may not. And the Gemara answers, the verse states, you shall perform, which teaches that the halacha applies to later generations as well. And the Gemara asks, but if so, why do I need the qualifying term from it? The Gemara answers that this term teaches from it, the Paschal lamb, the lack of circumcision of one's male children and slaves prevents a father or a slave owner from eating until he ensures that all the males of his household have been circumcised. But the circumcision of one's male children and slaves does not prevent him from eating teruma if he himself is eligible to eat it. Who is eligible to eat teruma? A priest, only a priest. Teruma is the consecrated food that is only permissible to eat by a priest. So he may eat teruma even though he hasn't attended to making sure that his son is circumcised, but he may not eat of the Paschal lamb. So what the Gemara is being careful to distinguish here is that the Paschal lamb definitely in its laws and customs is different than other areas of law. And here we can kind of take a step back and say, spiritually speaking, like sort of what is that underlying lesson that we're getting at? And what's really happening here is this is very much about Jewish unity, right? We've never been so unified as when we all walked together leaving Egypt, right? And then for the next 40 years, we were all together. There weren't Jews anywhere else. The whole Jewish people emerged from Egypt as one. Eventually, we were in the Promised Land. Problems started right away. It didn't take so long to have a civil war, and the two kingdoms split. Eventually, the Jews misbehaved. What just happened? What just happened? Oh my God. I think we're still live on YouTube. But for some reason, I don't know if we're still live on Facebook. I hope we are. Okay. I'll just keep an eye on that. Okay, I think we are still live. Sorry about that. Okay. So we were never so unified as when we walked out. Then eventually, we were in the kingdoms in Israel split, and eventually the Jews behaved so badly in terms of being custodians of the Holy Land that not only the first, but then the second temple was destroyed, and we ended up being scattered all over the world in the Jewish diaspora that's been going on ever since. In the 20th century, finally, after 2,000 years of longing, a state of Israel came into existence again, but nevertheless, the majority of Jews in the world do not live in Israel. They're still scattered all around the world. And this unity is something that is rare and fleeting, right? In Jewish life, there's very few moments when we really feel all together. But the one custom which is actually most universal among Jews, I mean, maybe lighting Hanukkah lights. But I remember seeing a stat years ago that really the thing that most Jews will participate in is a Seder, right? And the Seder, the Passover Seder, that night of Passover when we remember that they tried to, they enslaved us, they tortured us, they oppressed us, and God saved us as a people, right? As a people, we walked out. And so this is really a time to reflect on what does Jewish unity mean? How do we pull ourselves together as a people? Just like the whole world is so polarized now, the Jewish people are polarized, politically, religiously, culturally. There's so much breakage in the Jewish people. And certainly one of the lessons that we get from this, and that our great rabbis have been teaching for centuries, is that we can hasten the coming of Mashiach by having more Jewish unity. Right? We lost the temple because of baseless hatred among ourselves. We couldn't act in a unified manner, and perhaps we can, summon the Messiah and the coming of the third temple, the return of the temple, that axis between earth and heaven that should stand in this world by acting more as a unified people. I'm just spending a little bit of time on this subject because Purim is starting, in just a few minutes, and Purim actually teaches the same lesson, right? The same lesson. When in the Purim story in the book of Esther, as we'll be reading tomorrow at noon Pacific, we'll be doing it live. There was a threat to annihilate every Jew in the world. Persia was like such a maximal empire; it was like almost the whole known world. And Haman, the evil Haman, the wicked Haman, had prevailed on King Ahasuerus to issue a decree that went out by their very advanced technology of a communication system that they had to all the 127 provinces that on a particular day, this day, Purim, all of the Jews in the entire world were going to be murdered, right? And it's almost like, if we can't unify ourselves through love, then our enemies will unify us through their hate. And that's actually some people would say that that's one of the reasons that God has for permitting Jew hatred, anti-Semitism to exist. And it exists and has always existed and has been present in every generation, every century. Our enemies never stop hating us. And if we can't unify ourselves, well, then that pressure from the outside tends to have that unifying effect. And in the Purim story itself, there's a very important line when Queen Esther says to Mordecai, sort of she's locked up in the palace as it were, but she gets the word out through Mordecai to all the Jewish people. She says, "Tell all the Jewish people to join me in a fast," right? That's the fast that we're observing today. But the key word is all, that all the Jewish people should join in the fast. God's name is never mentioned in the Purim story. God's name is not mentioned in the book of Esther. But the idea that everybody prayed together, that everyone fasted and prayed together, shook the heavens, as it were, and resulted in a miracle. Not only were the Jews not killed, but they ended up on top and their enemies were all destroyed. Unity is very, very strong. All right, back to the subject of haste. The Gemara returns to discuss the Mishna, which stated that the Paschal lamb sacrificed in Egypt was eaten with haste, but the Paschal lamb sacrificed in later years were not. From where do we derive this halacha? The Gemara answers that it is as the verse states in Exodus 12:11, "You shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Paschal lamb." The word "it" indicates a detail, and it teaches that it is eaten with haste, and no other Paschal lamb is eaten with haste. Right? It could have said, "You shall eat in haste. It is the Lord's Paschal lamb," but it says, "You shall eat it in haste," right? That it was unnecessary, and therefore it becomes available for these derivations of the sages. It becomes available for interpretation. The Mishnah stated that the Paschal lamb of later generations applies all 7 days. The Gemara asks, on what does this stand? If we say that it refers to the Paschal lamb itself, is there a Paschal lamb all 7 days? It is offered only on the 14th of Nisan. Rather, it refers to leavened bread, which is prohibited all 7 days of Passover in the generations following the Exodus. The Gemara asks, does this prove by inference that during the Passover of Egypt, leaven was prohibited for only one night and not more? But wasn't it taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yosei HaGalili says, from where is it derived, that with regard to the Passover of Egypt, that its prohibition of leavened bread applied for only one day? And the verse states, no leavened bread shall be eaten, Exodus 13:3, and juxtaposed to that verse at Exodus 13:4, it states, this day you go forth, to teach that the prohibition of leaven applied in Egypt for only one day, because then they were marching, right? So they weren't worried about clearing the leaven out of their homes. They were all leaving their homes, right? And now they're camping. And they're on the road. So they were in a absolutely unique situation where the entire nation of Israel was on the road. So they were only able to observe the idea of eating matzah on the first night and removing leaven from their homes on that first day. For us, it's different. We remove leavened bread and keep leavened bread out of our homes for the whole 7 days of the Passover holiday. We're commanded to eat matzah just on the first night. After that, it's optional, but we may not have leavened bread or leavened products in our homes for the whole week. And that's where we end there. Okay, so that concludes the discussion of Mishnah number 5. Now for Mishnah number 6, I'm going to read the Mishnah and then get into the halachas. We're not going to do the Gemara on this Mishnah. We're just going to read the Mishnah, but then we're going to spend a little bit of time understanding what they're saying. Not a lot of time, but just getting into the definitions here so we understand. In fact, you know what? I'm gonna explain the concept first, and then we'll read the Mishnah, because the Mishnah will be more meaningful to us. So there's going to be a difference here between the English words substitute and replacement. Okay, so the Koran is going to use the word replacement to talk about the situation where you designate a lamb to be the Paschal lamb, and then it's lost. It wanders off, we lose it. Oh no, what are we going to do? We have to have a Paschal lamb so that we can fulfill our obligation. So at that point, we bring in a new lamb. That's the replacement lamb. A substitute lamb is where the lamb designated to be the Paschal lamb has not been lost. It's right there. But a person decides, for whatever reason, you know what? I'm going to substitute one lamb for another. Maybe I found a nicer lamb, or that I see something is wrong with that lamb, although it's not an actual disqualifying blemish. I have more people, so I want to have a bigger lamb. You're not allowed to do that. So the person makes a mistake thinking he can, and he substitutes one lamb for the lamb that's already been consecrated, and now he's created a problem because the Torah specifically mandates against that you may not bring a temura. We've already had the word teruma, which is just consecrated food. It's part of the tithing process. Now we're talking about temura, and this is substituting one consecrated animal for another, which is prohibited. So a substitute, it's prohibited to do where you have the consecrated animal and you try to substitute another one for it. Replacement it's unfortunate, but for some reason, the original lamb is lost or wandered off, or God forbid it died. And then you have to have, you need a replacement animal so that you can still fulfill your obligations. So those are two different concepts. Now, in the situation that an unblemished animal has been consecrated as an offering, it retains its sanctity even if it cannot be sacrificed. So if, for example, you have a situation where you've set aside the Passover lamb, and then it can't be sacrificed because all the people that were designated to eat it have become disqualified, so now you're not going to slaughter it for people who can't eat it. Okay, you're not going to slaughter it, but that animal is consecrated, so what are you going to do with it? You can't just return it to the herd. It's already been set aside for a holy purpose. So then what we do is it's left to graze until it becomes unfit. That is a holy animal. It can't be worked. It can't be eaten. You just let it eat and enjoy life. And then eventually, it will become unfit. In the case of a Paschal lamb, it won't even take that long because a Paschal lamb has to be less than 1 year old. So eventually, it ages out of being a qualified Paschal lamb. At that point, it's unfit for the purpose that it was originally designated. And at that point, once it has become unfit, it can be redeemed. You can sell it. Then what happens is you can sell it. It's no longer sacred. It can be used for whatever sheep are used for, but the money that you received when you sold this consecrated lamb that couldn't be offered, that money is consecrated. You can only use it for a holy purpose. It has to be used for an offering or donated to the temple. I mean, there's certain limitations, but the point is you can't just use that money for yourself. It's not your money. That money is set aside for God and holy purposes. With respect to the substitute, the tamura, the halakha of substitution is stated in the Torah as follows. This is Leviticus 27:10. He shall not alter it nor change it, a good for a bad or a bad for a good. You can't substitute a consecrated animal, even if you want to give a better animal. You can't do good for bad, and you can't do bad for good. And if he shall at all change beast for beast, then both it and that for which it is changed shall be holy. You intended to take the one that was consecrated and remove it from its holy function and put in this new animal to substitute for it. But what you actually did is you made both animals consecrated, and the one that was originally supposed to be offered is still the one that's supposed to be offered. The entire tractate Tamura is dedicated to explaining the laws of substitution. One who substitutes an unconsecrated animal for one that has been consecrated as an offering violates a biblical prohibition and is therefore flogged. However, again, in terms of flogging, that is the technical punishment. It's only going to be applied if the person was warned. If you do that, you will be flogged. There were 2 witnesses. He did it immediately after the warning. He goes to trial, etc. It's not like flogging was an everyday occurrence. It was almost a never occurrence. However, the second animal also becomes consecrated and attains a status comparable to the original consecrated animal. This rule does not affect offerings that are sacrificed on a free will basis, such as peace offerings and burnt offerings, as the substitute is simply sacrificed also. However, in the case of a sin offering, right, in other words, those other ones are optional offerings. A sin offering is obligatory once you've committed a sin. A Paschal lamb is obligatory once it's Passover if the temple is standing. Also for sin offerings, only when the temple is standing. However, in the case of a sin offering, which may not be offered twice for the same transgression, the substitute is left to graze until it becomes unfit. Now, with that little bit of background, we'll quickly read the Mishnah and then we'll be done. I'll come to your questions. Mishnah number 6. Rabbi Yehoshua said, I heard 2 rulings from my teachers. One ruling was that the substitute of a Paschal lamb is sacrificed. And another ruling is that the substitute of a Paschal lamb is not sacrificed. And I cannot explain these 2 rulings. Rabbi Akiva said to him, I will explain. With regard to a lamb that is separated as a Paschal lamb and is then lost, leading the owner to separate another animal as its replacement, and it is later found before the slaughter of the replacement Paschal lamb, so now the replacement is left to graze until it becomes unfit, right? So the original lamb was lost. They designated a replacement, and then they found the original before they slaughtered the replacement. So now the original resumes its place as the Paschal lamb, and the replacement is going to be left to graze until it becomes unfit. At that point, it is sold, and it becomes unconsecrated, and the owner must use the proceeds to bring a peace offering. And so too, the same is true with its substitute, right? So a substitute is different than a replacement. If one separates another lamb as a substitute for this replacement, all right, so now we're not talking about a substitute for the original lamb. Now they're going one step further. This is where it gets, complicated. But if somebody designated a substitute for the replacement lamb, The sanctity of the original lamb extends to the substitute as well. In the case outlined above, the substitute would graze just like the replacement until it develops a blemish and would then be sold. This is the circumstance in which the substitute of a Paschal lamb is not sacrificed. On the other hand, if the lost lamb is found after the slaughter of the replacement Paschal lamb, it itself is sacrificed as a peace offering, and so too its substitute is sacrificed, which explains the ruling that the substitute of a Paschal lamb is sacrificed as a peace offering. In order to make sense of this Mishnah and of this ruling, I mean, Rabbi Yehoshua was brilliant. Why couldn't he understand it? And Rabbi Akiva helped him understand that there we weren't talking about the difference between a substitute and a replacement. There we're talking about there is a replacement, and then they brought a substitute of the replacement or a substitute of the original, which was found. And that's where that nuance comes from. But all we really need to take from it for our purposes right now is we want to understand the difference between a substitute, which is a person wanted to change out a lamb that was still there, versus a replacement where a person brought a new lamb to replace one that was lost. Okay, let's go to comments and questions. Caleb, this is my first time watching, enjoying the learning. Good, Caleb, so great to have you here. Hope you're learning. Some days are more legal and technical. Other days are more, narrative and story and, kind of the more, spiritual. Some days are more legalistic. Some days are more spiritual. And what's beautiful about the Talmud is you never know what you're going to get that day until you read that page. Stephen, the reason why Hallel is not said, I think he is addressing a question I asked yesterday of why don't we say Hallel on Purim? The reason why Hallel is not said is in Tractate Megillah, and there are 3 reasons. So Tractate Megillah are the laws of Purim, which is beginning any moment now. In fact, I have to go to evening services. They start for me in 20 minutes. Okay. So the reason why Hallel is not said is in Tractate Megillah. Number 1, we do not say Hallel for events that happened outside Israel. Thank you, Stephen, for bringing us to that. By the way, we'll be getting to Tractate Megillah. How many tractates? It's not that many tractates away. The next one is Shekalim, and then Yoma, Sukkah, Beitza, Rosh Hashanah, Tanis, and Megillah. About 7 more tractates. Okay. Number 2, the Megillat Esther, meaning the scroll of Esther, the book of Esther, which we read at Purim, is considered as a Hallel. So interesting. So when we read the book of Esther, it's like reciting Hallel because we have to recite an entire book. We don't have to also recite Psalms 113 through 118, which is what Hallel is. And Stephen says, the third reason is confusing. It says there that we are still slaves to Achashverosh. I guess what we're saying there is we haven't recovered our land, right? So at that time, they hadn't. So, first of all, when the Esther story happens between the 2 temples, right? Between the destruction of the first temple and the rebuilding of the second temple. Eventually, the second temple was rebuilt. People went back to Israel, but the diaspora continued, right? It wasn't like the whole Jewish people flowed back in to Israel at that time. And so in this sense, I don't know about slaves to Achashverosh, but we are, in a secondary position since the Jewish people are scattered among the nations. And so in the sense that part of the story, which we were weak because we were in diaspora, that part hasn't changed. And perhaps that's another reason not to say Hallel at Purim. But at any rate, we say Hallel at the major festivals, at Passover, at Shavuos, at Sukkot. We say it every month at Rosh Chodesh when a new month comes in. We say it every day of Hanukkah. But we don't say it at Purim. So even though Purim and Hanukkah share that we recite thanking God for performing miracles for us in those days at this time, which we add to the Shemona Esrei, to the daily prayers. But whereas we do say Hallel on Hanukkah, we don't say, because Hanukkah happened in the Holy Land, But Purim happened outside of the Holy Land. It happened in Persia. And perhaps that's why we don't say Hallel now. Thank you so much. Nina had to leave. Those are the questions she left me. Let me just scan. Were there any other questions that I should answer? I'm not seeing. Okay, very good. That's what we've got. Purim is here. Everybody, Chag Purim Sameach, a Freilich and Purim. You should have such a joyful Purim. There is a halacha, a law, that people should become intoxicated, but there's many halachas that say that's not for people, that if they become intoxicated on Purim and they're going to harm themselves or others, then they are not only not obligated, they are prohibited, right? So you should not drink if your drinking is going to make you a problem to yourself or to others. If you are a person who can not only, drink in some quantity, but in that drinking, keep your mind focused on the concepts of Purim and on being thankful to God for deliverance and on trying to understand secrets of Torah, then the drinking, may enhance the religious observance. But if you're just drinking to get drunk, then you missed the point. Then that is no good, right? That is no good. And tomorrow we'll talk a little bit more about that when we read the book of Esther at noon Pacific. Have a great night.